Hi, Chris.
Hey, Matt. How's it going?
Fine. Should probably introduce ourselves. I'm Matthew Continetti. I'm Associate Editor of the Weekly Standard and the author of The K Street Gang, The Rise and Fall of the Republican Machine.
And I'm Chris Hayes. I'm the Washington editor of The Nation magazine and author of 0 books thus far. So,
I'm sure one's on the way.
But reader of a lot. I read a lot of books. So
yeah, well, that counts for something. Absolutely. Let's just take it away then.
Yeah, and let's talk some campaign. That's what the people want. I find. Tell me if you find this. I find sometimes I begin to think. I think wrongly, maybe because I'm trapped inside the DC bubble, that like we're way past saturation point on the campaign. But then I go back to New York and hang out with my folks, or I go to a barbecue over the weekend and talk to friends, people who don't get paid to follow politics for a living. All they want to do is talk about the campaign.
Right, absolutely. No, I recently returned from Germany, and 10 days in Germany and Brussels, Belgium, the Netherlands, and everywhere people wanted to talk about the campaign.
Yep.
Specifically Obama. They have Obama mania.
Yeah, they do.
In Europe, and it seems like we're having it here in the United States. I don't know if you've caught the latest issue of Newsweek, but there Barack Obama's in the cover again for, I think, the second time in 3 weeks, or the second time even in 2 weeks. And at this time, though, he has a halo of light above his head. Really just amazing thing to me, the hagiography of Obama, which one would assume wouldn't really start until after he's elected president, has in fact started before he's even clinched the Democratic nomination. So I guess we can begin by that. What do you attribute this love, this Obama mania to, Chris?
The Obama mania. Well, first, I think it should be pointed out. I followed Obama because I was in Chicago formerly, and I followed Obama since he began the very early days of his Senate primary campaign, which was in the fall of 2003, when he had about 3 or 4 staff. And I've actually seen, so if you look at the Chicago media, right, they're kind of like a leading indicator. I've actually seen several Obama boom-bust cycles already cycle through. So there's sort of hagiography, then there's backlash, there's hagiography, there's backlash. I think the thing driving the hagiography, frankly, or what when he does have these bouts of positive coverage, is the fact that he is a remarkably talented politician. I mean, this was what struck me when I went to see him for the first time at a fundraiser. He's a magnificent politician, and he just there's a sort of ineffable quality to charisma, whatever it is. If it's it's some combination of wit and smarts and sort of just physical bearing and vocal quality, all these kind of ineffable things combined to make a politician charismatic, and he possesses that. I don't think that's been manufactured anyway. Whatever that quality is, he possesses it. So and that acts on the press as much as it acts on citizens, I think. So a large part of it, I think, is just that. I think that the other thing, and the reason that I find myself at moments really swept up in the Obama phenomenon, distinct from my substantive agreements with him or my explicit preference for him over, say, John McCain or even Hillary Clinton, I think that the fact is there's a strong case to be made, one that I would make, that race and racial crimes and the color barrier is the sort of original trauma of American democracy, and the notion of a black president resonates with something very deep in the sort of core of the American narrative and experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what's interesting to me about the media's love of Obama is that it's coming from, I think, a different place than, say, the media's love of John McCain,
mm-hmm,
right?
Mm-hmm.
Where I think you could argue that the media loves McCain in large part, not in total, but in large part because of the access he gives them. On the bus, you're rarely separated from the candidate, this kind of freewheeling
mm-hmm.
Politician who will answer more or less every single question. That's slightly different, in fact, from Obama, where you see actually the campaign making quite some distance between the press and Obama. They don't have as much access as they would like. It's a big deal whenever Obama gives a news conference, for example. So there I think it's actually for different reasons, this love of Obama. Political ones, substantive ones, but also the kind of the broader issues that you talked about. You know, one interesting thing is I agree with you on the idea of Obama's personal charm and surely his presence and also his temperament. That's the one quality I do appreciate most in Obama. Is it seems he's just a level-headed guy and rarely, waxes and wanes.
Very cool customer.
He just seems to be on one basic emotional level all the time, and I do admire that. But I'm not sure how skillful a politician he is.
Yeah.
And what I'll bring up, of course, is what we've been arguing about in Washington for the last 2 weeks or so, and that's this whole question of appeasement and negotiation with dictators and the leaders of rogue states. Now, I'm not going to address the substantive issues there right now, but I do want to make a point.
But we should. We should.
We can if we want. But I do want to make just a point on the idea of the politics of it. Remember, I think Obama was slightly taken aback by that question when he was first asked it in a CNN YouTube debate by a random person in a video last summer. And he said, sure, why not?
Right.
That he would meet these meetings. And since then, which I think he assumed was a trifle comment, that's since been elevated on the one hand to, basically the central plank in his foreign policy at the moment. But on the other hand, he's also had, and he and his advisors have had to walk away from it. The most recent utterance now, him saying that doesn't necessarily mean he would meet with the Iranian President Ahmadinejad because, well, we're not sure, whether Ahmadinejad will be president when Obama is president, or if really Ahmadinejad's in the, actually in control of Iran. And of course, then that raises the question whether Obama is prepared to meet with Ayatollah Khamenei, who doesn't really meet with any foreign leaders, as far as I can tell.
He might make an exception, though.
He met with Mohammed al-Baradei, I know, last year briefly, and so that was the closest, I think, to a foreign dignitary to have an audience with the Ayatollah. So, missteps like that, I think we could see more and more of, and that may lead to the kind of backlash once Obama's safely in office on the part of the media.
Well, yeah, look, no one has ever, in terms of what the media is going to do, the boom-bust cycle is actually, I think, deeply it's almost in the incentive structure of, in fact, I have a friend who's a PhD he's an economist at the University of Chicago. I remember us taking walks and talking about how it would be a great paper to study the kind of market in sort of positive coverage in politicians. And we've seen it with, Newt Gingrich. That guy was he was like a tech stock, in 1998. There was, right after 1994, it was like, this guy is, the visionary of the future. He basically is running the country. The adulation was amazing. And then it was like, this guy's scum of the earth. He's like this reactionary troll. So, in some senses, you can't really control, I think, that kind of boom-bust cycle. And we'll see it, we saw it with Newt Gingrich. We saw, Bill Clinton was the subject of tremendous adulation and sort of admiring coverage at a certain point. And then obviously very, very different coverage at other points. And obviously things actually happen that affect it. But, so in terms of the boom-bust cycle, I think you're right. We'll see kind of, the press, we'll see press backlashes. On the politics of this thing, I would agree that I think that he answered that question at a kind of instinctual level, and that it has ascended in importance in a way that I don't necessarily think they would have predicted back then. I will say that that's part of a campaign. You make these kind of tactical choices. You see where you get traction in daylight. I don't think John McCain started this campaign saying, I'm going to run on a gas tax holiday, and that's, or that's going to be or even Hillary Clinton, certainly. So you see places in which you can create daylight, or you can create contrast between yourself and the opponent. You tend to amplify those. But I will also say what I think you see as political inexperience, and possibly is the product of not being in Washington for a long time, I find tremendously salutary, because I think he's right on the substance, and I think it's possible to make the case to make it right on the politics, even if everything we've learned about the politics of foreign policy, which is you want to get as far right, be as militaristic, as pro-war, as kind of anti-diplomacy as possible, which has been kind of the reigning political conventional wisdom in Washington for so long. I think the Obama campaign's instincts that there's a chance to break with that are right, and you can only break with it if you do kind of seize the moment and try to make the case. And I think they're doing a pretty good job of it. I mean, well, it remains to be seen.
Yeah, one thing I introduced just to complicate that a little bit is I think you're probably right that he's right on the politics of it, especially in the terms of a Democratic primary race, which he's still fighting. I'm not sure how well, though, it's going to fly, in the 6 months to go until the election, when he's going to be facing McCain. And it may be... Now, he does have an answer already, and he's engaged in this debate already with McCain. That's what we've been seeing over the past 2 weeks. And I think he's emerged pretty... Obama really hasn't been tarnished much as a function of this debate, but it's going to be one that happens again and again as the campaign draws to a close. It's a question of whether what events will come in between here and now, or what new issues will arise. But whether those independent voters who are going to be so key to this election will say at the end of the day, what, I do want a president who's prepared to make these, to have these high-level meetings. We can argue over whether Obama wants conditions or preconditions or not, but this what is truly a sea change in foreign policy, whether they're going to be comfortable with that at the end of the day, I think remains to be seen. I do agree that the Democratic primary voters are definitely aspiring to such a change.
Oh, I definitely agree. It's an open question. I mean, I don't think it's an open and shut case at all. I mean, from their perspective, what they want to do is frame it as diplomacy versus war, right? I mean, those are the choices, and that's obviously oversimplification. There's things in between, but as far as I can understand, in McCain's speech today, he basically renounced the current Bush administration posture towards North Korea. He basically said we want to go back, to the first term, sort of no talks unless they meet these certain requirements. Pull back from the talks we've already sort of been engaged in over the last, I guess it's about a year now. I think on the merits, I think there's a powerful argument. I'd like to hear what you think about this. Again, we sort of distinguish the substance from the politics here. I mean, I'm not a foreign policy expert. I have my own sort of principles and inclinations, which is that, diplomacy is better than war. And we probably have engaged in too little of diplomacy and too much war in the last 8 years. But I think that in terms of politics, I find it, and again, I'm not the target audience, so I wonder what you think. When he talks about, look, Mao was responsible, Mao had a nuclear arsenal and was responsible for probably the worst mass starvation and death in modern human history, and Nixon went and talked to him. Khrushchev and American presidents. We had. Here's the one I would like to hear you respond to. And it's amazing that this doesn't come up. Oliver North, right, conservative hero, sold weapons to Iran. He didn't just engage in diplomacy, he sold them weapons illegally. The same regime, right? Different people, but the same odious regime that has odious views. It wasn't like they were super into Holocaust reparations in 1981, right? They've been saying death to America and had this completely, this odious worldview for a long time. And Oliver North, conservative hero, sold this regime weapons.
Yeah.
Somehow this is...
I'm not going to defend that. The Bush administration is engaged in discussions with the Iranians now over Iraq, and Crocker has met with the Iranian counterparts. If I recall the reporting correctly, the Iranian counterpart wouldn't look Crocker in the eye, nor would he address him directly.
Right.
And so, of course, the Bush administration has these low-level contacts. This is seriously different from what Obama has said, which is that he is prepared to meet without precondition with the heads of these states.
Right.
And, of course, the Shanghai Communique, which was the foundation of Nixon's trip to China, was hammered out between Zhou Enlai and Henry Kissinger. It took months. It was a long process, and, of course, that whole meeting took place in a larger strategic context of détente, in which the Kissinger and Nixon wanted to split China, of course, from the Soviet Union and create a new force to exert leverage on the Soviet Union. There was an excellent op-ed piece in the New York Times last week about the Kennedy-Khrushchev summit, which Obama has been touting, which showed how actually Khrushchev got the better of Kennedy at that summit because of Kennedy's relative inexperience. And then Obama also says how Truman and Roosevelt met with Stalin, but he forgets that at the time that those meetings took place, Stalin was a war ally.
Right.
He wasn't the enemy. So I don't think the historical record necessarily supports Obama's position in these cases. And in fact, does he really want the historical record to support his position if he's arguing for a truly new break, a radical reorientation, as the words George Soros used in an interview with Judy Woodruff that was reprinted in the New York Review a few issues back, of American foreign policy? I mean, maybe it's to his advantage to stress the radical nature of this, or maybe not. Maybe he doesn't want to.
Well, no. I mean, I think it's an advantage. I mean, obviously, the whole idea, right, is that you're returning to some kind of main line of American foreign policy from which the Bush administration was a departure. Now, because I have some sympathies with the kind of Chomsky analysis of American foreign policy, I think that's easy to overblow. I mean, I think that we've engaged in a lot of essentially imperialist activities for a very long time under administrations, Democratic and Republican. But I do think the neoconservative, the Iraq War does represent a kind of break. I do think the sort of disinclination towards diplomacy has also been much more marked here. I will say that I think you make some good points, right, about what the details are of what this phrase "without preconditions" means. But I would also say this, right? I mean, obviously, he's not going to just, they're not going to, talk on the phone and he's going to say, well, meet me in wherever and jump on the plane. I mean, but I will say this. McCain's response, right, it's a response when he talks about meeting with Ahmadinejad. His response is a moral response. He says, basically, what would you have to say to someone who says that Israel's a stinking corpse or that denies the Holocaust, right? And I think the response of talking about Nixon and Mao or Khrushchev or whatever other, sort of diplomatic engagement you want to discuss is a specific rhetorical response to the notion that if someone has a completely odious worldview, if they hold odious beliefs or that are anathema to yours, that ipso facto means you can't talk with them diplomatically. And, of course, that's just not true, right? I mean, so McCain in some ways opens up that kind of rhetorical pathway because his response is, as we've seen about after the Bush speech in the Knesset, his response focused on exactly that. That basically this guy is a schmuck, for lack of a better word, Ahmadinejad, I mean, and why would you want to talk to a schmuck? And I think the response is, look, diplomacy happens, schmuck to schmuck often.
Yeah, no, and I think to that degree, the degree to which you're right, I think this has not been a very good debate for McCain. I mean, because McCain alternatively could stress, well, listen, the Europeans have been talking with Iran for years.
Right.
What's no effect.
Right, yeah.
The Americans were trying to talk to Iran over Iraq, and mixed effect. The Bush administration has done a total 360 in its diplomacy. Well, 360 would be a full circle. A 180. They've done a total 180 with their North Korea diplomacy.
Right.
And what's the effect?
Right.
I mean, North Korea is now, I think, more than a year late in this declaration of their nuclear activities.
Right.
And Chris Hill promises yet again, that's the undersecretary in charge of this process of state, he promises yet again that we'll get that declaration this week, maybe. We'll see. So, yeah, I think you're right. I think if McCain just makes this ad hoc objection, which is kind of, he's a bad guy, he said these horrible things, we don't want to talk to him. It's not necessarily a winning argument because it leaves Obama in a position of superiority where he's saying, well, we can talk to even the worst guys and I'm ready to talk to anybody.
Right.
But I think a truer argument, a better argument for McCain would be to say, look, we're talking.
Right.
We're talking, and at the end of the day, it's not a process question. It's an ends question. It's these regimes want things different from what the United States and its allies want.
Right.
And they're not necessarily going to give up what they want simply because America is engaged in quote unquote robust diplomacy with them. But let's switch topics for a little bit. We kind of talked about Obama, and we've introduced McCain here. He's had a pretty interesting ride, observing the McCain campaign from the outside. It's so different from the Obama campaign, right? I mean, not only, of course, the gross disparities in monies raised or what, but Obama also spends, as one McCain staffer pointed out to me last week, he said, look, Obama raises a lot of money, but he's also spending a lot of money because he has this huge campaign apparatus.
Right.
Whereas McCain is still basically, they're just beginning to staff up. They're more or less in the shell that was left over when McCain's primary campaign collapsed last summer. they're only now beginning to hire more people, and this staffer told me, they're not going to hire as many people as George Bush had in 2000. So it's a much more rambunctious operation. It's a total fly by the seat of your pants, and they give these speeches, one day tacking to Bush's left, the next day tacking to Bush's right.
Yeah.
And, of course, now McCain's own self-righteousness, which is a tick in his personality, has led to a complete and total revetting of every single operative associated with the campaign, because McCain has created these rules in his own head about, which lobbyists are allowed to be close to him and which are not.
And can I say on that, I actually think the policy is overkill in some ways. I mean, but the irony to me, I have to say, I don't understand the McCain campaign at all. I mean, I really don't. Like, just even at the basic political level, like, the Obama campaign, I feel like, whether you, and I obviously we have different feelings about what it is on the merits, but it's got a pretty coherent narrative that hasn't changed a ton. Sure. And, it changes, obviously, he's trying to appeal to this constituency more than that constituency because he has to add them to a coalition, and that's the way campaigns are. But there's this pretty, change and hope and, sort of undoing some of the damage the last few years, and on foreign policy, diplomacy and healthcare and, whatever the kind of major themes are. There's been this... I can't really make sense in the McCain campaign, and I don't think that's just because I'm disposed, obviously, to disagree with it substantively, but like you said, they're attacking from the left one time, from the right in other places, and in ways that make both zero political and, to me, substantive sense. And then there was the whole lobbyist thing, in which the chief irony to me was the whole thing is occasioned by the fact that, again, amidst this conversation about why would you want to have a conversation with Ahmadinejad, he says these nasty things. Charlie Black is on the payroll of Mobutu Sese Seko, which obviously there's a little bit of contradiction there. But they respond by, A, keeping Charlie Black, and then coming up with this amazingly kind of draconian requirement for the lobbyists in the campaign, and letting go of all these people. It made no sense to me.
No, it doesn't. I mean, I think the larger question here is what you point to, which is kind of a lack of a narrative. I mean, the storyline, right, is for Obama is very simple. Change, right? New generation, right. And of course, also all the historical significance an Obama presidency would have. Right. With McCain, the storyline is garbled. We had an excellent essay last week in the Weekly Standard by Yuval Levin
at
the Ethics and Public Policy Center, proposing that McCain create a storyline of reform, which is something that has been dear to his heart. And that is, reform of America's governmental institutions, which are facing and have faced over the last several years a crisis of authority.
Yep.
He's not really there yet, and you'll hear from McCain people, "Oh yeah, it's great," and the next day it kind of doesn't really peter out. He has these ideas he'll come up with. McCain's kind of version of Prime Minister's questions if he were elected president, where he'd go to Congress and face Congress, face to face, more or less rhetorically. I think that's
which would be
a great idea. It'd be a great idea, but it doesn't fit into any of the. It's this kind of that's really cool. And he has this economics program, which is kind of Bush on steroids.
Right.
But then he also has a cap and trade support for a cap and trade program, which is basically an indirect tax.
Right.
So it's a mixed bag, but at the end of the day, what McCain has going for him is that he is a very lucky man, and he was left for his political death last summer,
right.
And here he emerges as the Republican nominee without any broad constituency or even really enthusiastic support in the Republican Party. And I think a guy who's kind of escaped, death, literally, and political death before, has got to feel confident that he may prove lucky again. But of course, that doesn't make for a very effective campaign, and it means that it's going to be a mixed message. And really, in my mind, the one guy who can make John McCain president isn't John McCain. It's Barack Obama.
Right.
And at the end of the day, that it will be Obama's failure, not McCain's success, that would lead to a McCain presidency, in my view.
Right, and I think that I would agree with that, actually. And I think that, my feeling about McCain, and part of what I think I find so hard to kind of track about the whole thing is that, first of all, he's sort of in the opposite position you would want a nominee in this. People talk about, well, he's actually the ideal nominee because he's not associated with the Republican Party. He has this kind of independent reputation, which I think is a little bit overstated. I think among high information people, that's the case. But I don't know once you push towards the boundaries of the kind of lower information swaths of the electorate, particularly independents, how much that's the case or still the case. But what I think you would want is something like what Bush was able to do in 2000, which is someone who had this constituency among the right shored up such that he could tack to the center in a way that was very convincing for a lot of people. Whereas McCain has spent so much time scampering around to kind of shore up his base and, getting the endorsement of Hagee and Parsley and going to the NRA and making nice with Grover Norquist. All these people that much to his... much in his defense, he alienated in the early part of his career. Right. But the problem is that the kind of center turn that he now has to make, veer towards the center, is just too temporally close to the right turn he had to make in the primary. So it's like, if John McCain could run as 2002 John McCain, that 2002 John McCain would be the perfect Republican candidate in this election. But instead, it's 2008 John McCain who kind of made his peace with the right establishment enough to win the nomination, but never really kind of, I think, and you'd know better than I think sort of eliciting any real enthusiasm. And now he's kind of carrying, in order to get that, he's now carrying this baggage that I think is going to be difficult for him to kind of shrug off in this electoral environment.
It is. And but at the same time, a presidential contest is between two people,
right?
And so it will come down fundamentally to
sadly it's between two people.
Well, we're entering the silly season of presidential politics, which is once the nominees are more or less confirmed, but before the conventions, and so we're going to have all this back and forth and all these questions of, McCain's making the wrong decisions, or there was that, of course, the Sunday story in the New York Times by Nagurny about Republicans worried about McCain's campaign, and I think their concerns are justified to a large degree.
Made up for, I would add, by the Politico article the next day about McCain strategist C blowout or whatever it was. Like, those stories were like back-to-back days.
I know. But, why are they seeing that blowout? And they're seeing that blowout because they're extrapolating the efficiencies of Obama's from the primary. And this is a big question. Rui Teixeira thinks that there's no way that you can extrapolate voter results in November from the primaries in the first part of this year. And what have the primaries shown us? It shows that the white working class and Latinos have major reservations about Barack Obama. And these are Democrats. Now, if that carries over to November, then the McCain scenario, looks pretty good for McCain. Right. So to me, that's actually the major question of this election is, and we'll find out. I mean, it will be confirmable.
Yes, right. That's right.
Can you extrapolate from these primary results? Or were we able to extrapolate from the primary results what would show up to be Obama's weaknesses in November?
No, and I think that's legitimate fear. I mean, people are worried. I mean, look, the Democratic Party is about to nominate a man named Barack Hussein Obama, who is a black man, whose father is from Kenya, who comes from a very liberal neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. Yeah. To be the president of the United States. I mean, It's crazy, right? At a certain level. I mean, I don't, when people talk about, their worries about Obama's electability or his appeal in certain areas, there's reason to worry that people won't vote for him. And I think the problem he's had, which I do think is more regional than kind of, socioeconomic, which is around Appalachia, has sort of been pointed out in the blogs quite a bit recently. Mm-hmm. But that matters because Pennsylvania and Ohio, and parts of Virginia and Michigan, they share some important parts of the geographic reason in which he's had problems. So there's no question that's something to cause concern, and I think I'd imagine his strategists are thinking about. One thing I do think is interesting, I think this maybe neatly segues us into a sort of the next topic, is I'm curious from your perspective to game out from the right's perspective, let's say that John McCain does win in November, basically by making Obama just unchoosable, right? I mean, essentially, which I think in some senses was the explicit avowed strategy of the Bush campaign in 2004, which was really to kind of make Kerry make people just be unable to pull the lever for John Kerry.
Right. I mean, Kerry was trying to do that for Bush too.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. This is what politicians do to one another. They try to make the others seem unelectable. But please continue. Yeah.
Well, they do, but there's a difference, right? I mean, there's a difference between.
There isn't.
You don't think there is? So
No.
You don't think no?
Politics is politics. Both sides do these attacks.
No, of course. Look, both sides attack, but I'm actually talking about this. Here's what I would point to.
Sure.
The way that the 2004 election was run made turning around and getting up in February and saying, let's privatize Social Security, really hard to do. Because Bush didn't go around the country saying, elect me to privatize Social Security. He said...
I agree with you there.
And he said, elect me because, I'm strong on defense and John Kerry is a flip-flopper. Now,
absolutely.
So the question is, if John McCain wins on basically Barack Hussein Obama as a scary, quisling appeaser, whatever... what does John McCain walk into the office in January able to do? Or what, you know what I mean? Like, and from your perspective, I'm curious to hear you game that out. Like, what does a John McCain victory substantively look like?
Right. No, I think that's an interesting question, because with the Democrats, either one winning or Obama, let's just say Obama, because he'll in all likelihood be the nominee, right? He has a clear agenda, right? He needs to start showing that he's focused on the exit in Iraq, right? And we don't know what that means.
Right.
I happen to think that the Democrats are serious when they say they will begin withdrawing, but others don't. And but anyway, he needs to show that he's looking for the exits, because that's what he's explicitly campaigning on.
Right.
Okay, so that's one part of his agenda. The other part, of course, is health care.
Exactly.
I mean, so there's his second part,
climate change.
And then the third part will probably be climate change, or something like that. I mean, it doesn't seem like he has. If I'm wrong, it seems to me that those are maybe the three biggest parts of his agenda. With McCain, it's a harder thing to say, right? I mean, what is he going in? And of course, successful politicians do have an agenda that you can usually say, whittle down to 3 or 4 points. Take George Bush, when he was first elected in 2000. Education reform, tax cuts, right? And Medicare, prescription drugs.
That's right.
Okay?
Yep.
He enacted all three.
Yep.
He was successful.
Right.
Ronald Reagan, when he was elected in 1980, major tax cuts, right? That was the central plank, and the other part of his major plank was a defense buildup. He got both.
Right.
What's McCain? It's hard to say. I agree with that. Now, he has his economic agenda, which is actually extremely ambitious. He also has a healthcare agenda, and he has a climate agenda. But he hasn't, because I think of this storyline that's so all over the place that we've already discussed, he hasn't kind of prioritized them. And that's probably because McCain's top priority is to continue the surge policy in Iraq.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah, right.
And that's what he wants. And he's going to campaign on that. He didn't shy away. He has not shied away from that.
No, you're right. That's a good point.
Credit.
I mean, if he wins, right? I mean, no one can say they're surprised, right?
Right.
If we, I mean, I don't know where one would get the troops to continue.
I will say, I'll make a guess, right? Because that's what they pay us to do. I would say McCain's top domestic priority would, one of which, there are two. One is health care. I think he will do that. There is actually a Republican response and health care agenda that's been worked out, that McCain has given speeches on, and that I think he would try to force Congress with an electoral mandate
to deal with.
Yeah. The other one is immigration, which he has said it doesn't get much play, but he is still for kind of a Bush-Kennedy compromise bill, and I think that's something that would be achievable, even with a Democratic Congress that in all likelihood will have expanded Democratic majorities in the House and Senate. And then the third will be a climate bill. And so that's actually that would be an illustration of how on a lot of our politics the center of gravity has shifted to the left.
That's right, because those three. I mean, right in terms of the terrain that it's playing on, whatever the mechanics of the solutions are. I mean, it's like you could have Democrats proposing a crime bill or Republicans proposing a crime bill, but it's at the end of the day, it's a crime bill.
Absolutely,
and that
absolutely,
and that loops in with the eternal wither conservatism question, which was the subject of a long George Packer essay in the New Yorker, loosely structured around a book by my very dear friend Rick Perlstein called Nixonland, which has been getting quite a bit of buzz, I think quite rightfully so. And sort of talks about Nixon as this iconic figure in developing the contours of what we have come to call the culture war, blue state, red state. And the thesis, I guess, of the Packer essay, if there was a specific one, was that kind of sort of culture war conservatism, that marshalling this sort of silent majority resentment, it's been against different targets at different times. That it's kind of run its course, and conservatism. Obviously, the electoral prospects for Republicans don't look particularly good this election season, but that there's a deeper, ideological exhaustion among conservatives. And he goes around and gets people like, Pat Buchanan has this quote about all great movements start as movements, become businesses, and end up as rackets, which is something you yourself, in some senses, wrote a book about. I mean, I saw a small slice of that.
Yeah.
And David Brooks, expressing his frustrations with. So I'm curious. I'm not really in a particularly good place to judge, the accuracy of this of the Packer essay, or its how reflective it is of conservative thinking. And I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I thought the article was silly. For one thing, Packer hardly at all mentions the Iraq War. Right, which if the Iraq War had been prosecuted differently and had led to a different result, none of these problems would exist, in my view. You wouldn't. I mean, the whole Bush's political capital would have risen. The Republicans wouldn't have been left with basically nothing to run on except their own corruption and lack of progress in Iraq on 2006. So I thought that was a huge omission on Packer's part. He also got something wrong. Just the vaunted New Yorker fact-checkers need to look a little bit closer. He says that Norman Podhoretz passed the editorship of commentary to his son, John Podhoretz. It's true that John will be the editor of commentary next January, but of course for about 10 years plus, Neil Kozodoy has been the editor of commentary, which Packer doesn't mention. And he makes an unusual decision to have Pat Buchanan as the authentic voice of conservatism. I mean, certainly Buchanan represents a certain strain of conservatism, but it's also one that the most important figure in American conservatism, in my view, of the last quarter century plus, Ronald Reagan, explicitly denied. And that was the Reaganite Paleocon split. And so for all these reasons, I thought the Packer essay was unusual. I mean, there's no question that the Republican Party is in horrible straits right now, and there's no question that conservatives are facing a bout of, really low self-confidence, to put it mildly. But on the other hand, let's look at all the amount of rethinking that has gone just in the past 2 years on the conservative movement, with writers like our friends Ross Douthat and Reihan Salam, with David Frum, Newt Gingrich, of all people, putting out these new ideas.
Reform the Census Bureau.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, newts are unique, to say the least. The author I mentioned earlier, Yuval Levin, a younger writer who's just brilliant, in my view, and has tons of ideas about how to re-energize conservatism. So I'm just a little... In a way, this is actually a moment of conservative intellectual vitality and ferment.
Yes, right.
Even though perhaps the Republican political class isn't reflective of that.
Yeah.
But that's only a function, in my view, of leadership. And a lot of these Republicans are simply idiots, and they're so focused on maintaining their districts in the face of a sinking ship that they're not reaching out to these new ideas and these new messages which are out there.
Well, it's the innovator's problem, right? I mean, I forget the management expert who sort of wrote about this, about how it's essentially it's entirely rational for a business to sort of miss the next innovation, right? Because what's rational is to continue on the path, if you've had success, to continue on the path you've gone on, and it's only natural that the innovation is going to come. I mean, Reihan and Ross are a good example insofar as, you know, they're not. I mean, Ross more so than Reihan, but they're both, you know, not really in the sort of center, I would say, of the conservative movement, or they have a kind of interestingly peripheral and complicated relationship to it.
Sure.
And I think, you know, this is just the case, I think, in any enterprise, in any ideological movement, that it becomes difficult to, you know, and Perlstein actually writes about this very interestingly in his first discussion about the Talking Points Memo Book Club, about the book, where he talks about how, you know, liberals were really blindsided by the rise of conservatism in the mid '60s, late '60s, and early '70s, and they had this image, this stereotype of conservatives as, you know, guys in spats and monocles and top hats, and they couldn't detach themselves from,
right.
And it proved to be really politically disastrous for them because they just they sort of refused to take it seriously. I don't necessarily know if that's the same case here, because I do think that a kind of resurgent progressivism or liberalism is, I think, taken seriously by the right now. And I also think you're right. I mean, the thing about the war with Packer, I completely agree with, and it's so weird to me that the role the war plays in the discussions of, you know, our politics. I mean, it does get bizarrely bracketed in this sort of strange way, I think. You know, or it's either on the front page, or it's just it's again, it's gone through these sort of similarly boom-bust cycles of attention, and I also noticed that omission. And again, you know, perhaps part of the reason, right, is that Packer was one of the most prominent kind of liberal hawk voices.
Maybe,
you know, yeah. throwing his weight behind a war that, you know, has proved to be a disaster.
Right.
So, you know, I agree. You know, I would say, I mean, I think the counterfactual of if the Iraq War was executed, you know, successfully is a little misleading, just because I think that that's a difficult counterfactual to get to. But I think that if for instance, we just didn't invade Iraq, if the war had never happened, I think Republicans would be in far, far, far better shape.
Right. Well, I'll disagree with you there, but you know, we could end this by agreeing to disagree, which is always the most, I think, the best we can do in dialogues.
That's right.
All right.
All right, Matt.
Well, it was very nice talking to you, Chris.
Yeah, likewise.
Yep.
Cheers.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.